Hello, everybody. ODAT Nerd here, aka Terrence. This is the pre recorded video that is going to play at the start of every Devember video. So, what day is it? If you're watching this on the day that I recorded it, probably a day in December. What day? I don't know. I'm not creating 31 of these things. This is to tell you that we are working on the Devember project, which is a remote build system in Sublime Text. Now, down in the description, if I have done my job correctly, there should be a link to the playlist that has all of the videos in this series, which starts with the video that describes what the heck it is we're actually trying to build here. And this video will be a minimum of an hour long. I don't know how long it's going to go because I haven't recorded it yet. It's still November right now while I'm reading this to you out of my brain. It's not actually written down anywhere. I think that's probably easy to tell. I'm not very good at talking off the top of my head into a camera. So what are we going to be doing tonight? Don't know. Hopefully working on something really interesting, though. Probably should have thought that through a little bit more. In any case, we're going to go ahead and say the following. If you like these videos and you want to know when there's going to be more of them, subscribe to the channel, link in the description. If you're interested in videos that aren't live in nature, there's another channel I have that is going to be providing those. I have in the past and I will again. I'm just not right now because I'm doing this every day for December and it's taking up all my free time. Link to that is in the description. Like any videos that you find useful, comment on any videos if you have any questions, and most importantly, have a good time. So let's go ahead and give it to myself in the present, if you will, to continue on faceless because I don't have the sort of setup that allows me to stream my face while I'm working. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Devember the 14th. First off, felicitations. We totally missed a Friday the 13th. That was close. Second of all, my apologies if you were watching this stream last night and wanted to see the code that we checked in. Had some encoding issues getting the vlog ready, and while I was babying it to make sure that the upload was going to finish, I fell asleep on the couch and didn't realize until this morning that I hadn't actually checked in the code. So that did go up early this morning once I realized that. Unfortunately, it's tagged as yesterday, but in the world of sadness that the commits have today's date on them. That is terrible. Now, when it comes to things done about the project between last night and today, all I can say is I thought about it. I am not sure that I'm any closer to knowing exactly how this should work than I was last night, but that is what learning is all about. So I think we have at some level the core tools in our toolbox to know how to do this. So we can go ahead and just we're going to work our way through it and see what we come up with. I'm also kind of sad that I had to turn the fan off in here because it's a little bit warm, but I don't want it to interfere with the audio. Now, as you can see, I have here in the browser open the os.walk help because there's something in here that it occurred to me after everything last night while I was doing the vlog, and that is that perhaps as an optimization on this, and I don't think there's any perhaps about it realistically, if we're going to be generating this stuff in Python, one thing is we probably want to try to gather these files in a thread. We don't want to do it in response to the command like we're doing here, because if there was a particularly big folder, it would take like a long time to grab all of the files, and as long as your command is doing something, Sublime's not responding to user input, so that would be terrible. I didn't notice that last night. It's just something that always occurs to me. Easy enough to throw this into a thread later on. Override audit, as a matter of fact, whose code we looked at last night, gathers all of the contents of the package folder in a thread. So totally in known territory there. But the other thing is, if we are excluding things, and one of the things we're excluding on is a folder segment, then maybe we can optimize things by discarding, if we detect first that a directory is something that is supposed to be excluded, we could just throw it away completely and not care one bit that that was even there, and then prune away whole parts of the tree. And as we can see here, first of all, when we call this os.walk, somewhere's in here, we're passing it the search path and we're saying follow links false, which is actually the default. So we don't really need to do that. I just said it's a false because I was specifically following links in my code in override audit, because I was pretty sure it wasn't going to be a loop and I used links. But for the purposes of this, note the only argument we're passing is just the path to search. And if we look here, we can see that that means that the top-down parameter is set to true by default. And this says that if top-down is true, you can modify the dir names, which is the second argument in the tuple that comes out of this. You can modify it in place, and then when walk goes into the next loop, it'll only recurse into subdirectories whose names are still in there. So we can use that to prune away entire parts of the tree, or we could inject other directories or change the order that they're visited, or any one of a number of things. So if that was the case, then the first thing we might want to do is do our exclusions for path excludes here directly and throw stuff away. And that also led me to something else that I am not 100% sure of, which is this. Now this says file include patterns is files to include, and anything not matching these patterns will be excluded. It's checked before file exclude patterns, and file exclude says it's checked after file include patterns. So the general sense of the thing is, as it's going, it looks here to see if it should include it, and it assumes it should include it if there's no entry in here, because you'll note there's no file include pattern star.star. And then, and only then, does it check this if it thinks it needs to include it. Makes perfect sense. You either just provide nothing, in which case you get every file, or you provide this, in which case you only get these files, or you provide this, in which case you get all of these files, all files except these ones, or you provide them both and then you get all the files that match here as long as they don't match this. Perfect sense. Same thing happens for folders. This is checked before folder excludes. This is checked after folder includes. The same thing applies to these. The question remains then, what order are these for paths? Now, it's not explicitly stated here, but one would imagine that path checking has to come before file checking, because file include patterns isn't supposed to include path segments, I don't think. I'm pretty sure I've seen people complain on the forum about that, in which case this is the part that we have to do first, right? And if that's the case, then we can really restrict exactly stuff out of a list if one was so desirous of doing so, and really do a lot of stuff. So that's the avenue we're going to start here in this particular stream, starting roundabout nowsy. Unfortunately for me, my watch, which I use as a timer, is currently in the charger, but maybe I can, yeah, I don't think I am allowed to work it as a timer. So if we assume an hour is 9:08, I tend to go to 9:30. We'll have plenty of time. And there was some other stuff in here. One of the other things I mentioned in the devlog last night was something that we did not discuss when we were setting this up, is how this folders list can appear in your build. And it uses the one in the build, or if it's not specified, the one in the project, or if it's not specified, the one in the folders, or if it's not specified, the current file. But in our file gather function, we're just doing project, then folders, then current file. But as it transpires, and it took more than like 35 seconds to figure this, um, I'm calling self window here. If this had an extra argument that was folders and it was defaulted to none, it could do this. But if you passed it an argument that was folders, then it could use that instead. So basically this stuff would be an if folders is none, do this, otherwise figure out the folders and the path and do something with it there. And folders is something that would be passed to our build command when it's executed. So that would just automatically go in. As it transpires, that was minorly more complicated than it needed to be because I didn't want to give any thought. The stream was like 10 minutes from starting to what happens with this, because the way this is currently set up in our sample build, this isn't valid because this should be an absolute path. It shouldn't be a relative path. If it's a relative path, what's it relative to? Well, that brings up the question that we might want something in here called project root or something I had considered in the past. But in any case, that's easy enough to add later once we have those questions sorted out. And the more important question to answer is, how do we do this stuff? So we know that when we call this command is responsible for figuring out all folders. It either provides a file, which incidentally needs to also check these criteria. So this is still not fully done. As a matter of fact, we might even throw a to do. Oh, not there. My bad. I think that there. This one. There we go. We'll say to do either say that, I guess. No, we don't even need to do that. Never mind. I was overthinking that. If we get here, there are no folders. If there are no folders, there was nothing to have a file exclude pattern. There's nothing to exclude this. That just works. Perfect. Ooh, I like when that happens. So we might say for this, just print ders here. And we'll come down here and comment out this. So now when we hit the key, we just see the list of directories, which as we can see is a lot of empty directories a lot of the time. And then here are some other type folders. Now it starts to become clear why perhaps, why the folder exclude patterns and folder include patterns are included in this thing to begin with, the way they are, because this would be pretty simplistic to trim them out, I think. I would imagine that this is in no way implemented in Python in Sublime's core. The file list that's gathered is totally done in a optimized C code or C++ code because it's used to power the sidebar and the indexing, and Sublime internally knows every file that's in the project. Add me to the list of people that wishes there was an API that you could call to discover files or folders that are stored in a package that already has these lists exposed. But by gar, I bet you that is not an easy set of data to transmit in the general case. For example, I'm doing an Angular project at work, and as such, I totally, bumped into that thing where if you use Node.js, various things explode in your face because anytime you create a Node.js application, you're required to download the entirety of the whole internet into the Node modules folder because everything in Node.js seems to depend on every other thing in Node.js. Maybe I'm a little bitter that I have to use Node. In any case, that is actually a lot faster than you would expect it to be. But in any case, let's just continue on here. If this iterates through all of the files and calls files for folder and has the appropriate information, this pulls all that information out, and that is the list of folders. We might even go so far as to say if dirs, print dirs, so that when we clear the console and pull one of these, it's a lot smaller. And we can see directly that is definitely going to get pulled. If Git was pulled, all of those would disappear, and those would disappear. Those are all inside Git, and those are all inside Git. This is the part where we're inside the remote build server. A bunch of these, might disappear because those are in bin. So let us focus our attentions first on some method whereby we can take a list of these, for example, and compare it against path includes and path excludes to come up with just a list of things that should be included. And that will be our first step, because then we'll be able to easily prune away things we don't care about. And if that's the case, this whole keep thing that's called in here might not actually even be needed. We'll find out. For our purposes, we might say def keep prune folders. Let's call it prune folders. And what would it get as an argument? It would get, well, yeah, we'll call it folders, and it would get includes, and it would get excludes, and it has to return something, let's say. Okay, now just for temporary purposes sake, and this is why I always, when I'm doing stuff like this, create a command and bind it to a key, because a lot of the time I like to iterate this way and build up the pieces that I need in a Lego-like fashion. So that's going to be the list of folders. Now I can pprint dirs like so, and I might say dirs that is equal to prune folders, dirs, and that, let's say. Whoops, let's not say that though. And then if I was to run the command, we just see the same list of directories, because this is directly returning stuff. Now, we know that the first thing is going to be, if we look up here, two references on 36, huh? That doesn't necessarily seem right. Includes, then excludes. So one thing we might want to try first is, what do we want to exclude? Well, we want to exclude .git. And let's say we also exclude the other thing that's normally in one of these. I cannot type for the life of me. Exclude. Another one might be .svn, let's say. Yeah, that it's been so long since I used Subversion, I could not remember. Like so, and let's say, so we'll also say .svn here as well. It's not one that's actually used, so that's like a nice test. And there we're going to see that. So that is a beauty. Now we're going to pop up here again. And as a matter of fact, maybe for our purposes, we could just shuffle this down here and put it back up there later when we're actually done with it, and then the code will be handy dandy for us here. Now I'm going to open the console on the other window. So I apologize in advance if I accidentally close this and refer to things on the console, because that is less interesting for people. Now let's first declare our intentions for this, because that helps me, at least in my head, clarify to myself what I'm actually going to be writing. Say, given a list of folders, return a copy of it that includes just the folders that should be considered part of the build based on the given list of include and exclude patterns. The filters are applied in the order include, exclude. We'll do that such that if there are no includes, we assume that everything is included by default. And is there anything else to say about this? May or may not require case sensitivity. We'll throw that as a to-do on here. And the reason for that is just that most file systems on Linux boxes are case sensitive, and Windows is not, and Mac OS can be either way, and at least for a long time, although you could turn it on, it was highly recommended that you not, because various things go horribly wrong. And this is one of those things that in the early days of porting games from Windows to Linux went horribly wrong because developers, it turns out, are very lazy about figuring out what paths they should be using for things. So I do this in override audit as well, and I just have a simple lambda that assumes that it should be case sensitive on Linux, and it assumes it shouldn't be case sensitive on Windows and Mac OS, which may or may not be the case. One of the things I'm going to look at is now Sublime supports case sensitivity, so maybe I need to do something there, but that sort of requires doing a file system check for the packages folder, creating a file with a weird case, and then seeing if it exists in another case to see what the operating system says, and blah. So we're just going to go ahead and throw that there. So the filters are applied in the order include, exclude, such that if there are no includes, we assume everything is included by default. Now, one other thing we could do here is short circuit the case where there, in fact, is no list of folders at all. So that's something to consider. Now, we might say result is this, and then say for folder in folders. And there could be a way to do this perhaps with an inline list expression, the name of which escapes me at the moment because it's kind of late. But what might we say here? We want to, okay, if not includes or folder in includes, get inside here. If folder not in excludes result dot append folder and then return result. That seems like it might do something. So we'll iterate over every folder for everyone. If the list of includes is empty, then it's always included. Or if it's in includes, then it is included, otherwise it's not included. And then we only get inside here if we think we should include it, and in that case we only keep it if we haven't been told to exclude it. So if I did this, we see the git falls out, but remote build server, net test, and enum totally applies. Now, let's also test this because this is includes. So if we wanted to include net test, then regardless of anything else, only net test should come out, right? Makes sense. If this list was empty, we get back to that. And if this list was again similarly made empty, we end up with, ooh, a terrible problem because I added one of those too many. And we come back to what we were. So I think that's probably doing what we want. So there we go. And I believe I did test the situation where they're both empty. So that was actually pretty simple. So that's nice. So again, we'll go and pull that and put it back where we thought, like so. And now if we toggle this, we end up with that big list of stuff. And remember, it's got all that git crunk and junk in it too. And not only does it have the git files, as we can see there, but inside remote build server, we also see the object folder and the contents of the object folder. And we see the PyCache with that thingy there. So if I was to grab this, how might we apply that to this? The os.walk is this thing, right? So I'm going to do that, but we are going to replace this so it goes includes path, includes path, excludes. Good. Now at this point, that's just throwing away the contents of this, the directories that are contained in the folder we're looking at. The files in the folder we're looking at remain untouched. And once it's going to do all of the files in this, and then it's going to loop around and go into the directories that are the subchildren of this until it gets all the way down, right? So if one was to do that, then I think by default, assuming everything is good, we've automatically redacted away Git. And we've automatically redacted away all that stuff in the bin folder. The obj folder is gone. The debug folder is gone. The bin folder is gone. The PyCache folder is gone. So that has done exactly what we wanted it to do. Now, if I was to again look at, well, how did I end up with two of these now? That's an intriguing question. We want to edit the project. That did not seem to do a whole lot of anything, did it? Oh, because it's in that window over there. Thank the stars. Okay, there isn't any include patterns in this project, and there isn't any file include. So we're going to have to gin our own up for that. And I closed all those windows, but let's say this might be the sort of situation in which we need to turn some stuff back on that I just finished doing. I'm going to print name here because I believe we'll find that when it prints that, it gives us just the name of the file and not anything else, right? And if that's the case, we can do the thing that we just did. We'll say to do, well, we'll just copy this. In fact, we'll probably be to doing that in just a second. And then I'm going to cut that from there and bring it back down to here so that we can continue with this. Now, this is going to be a different spec. It's going to take a file name and it's going to take includes and excludes. And we might have this. Well, we might steal this whole thing and see how much that applies to this, because I'm willing to bet it's more or less the same. Given a list of file names, no, we're not returning a list. Okay. Sorry, just not. given a file name, return a Boolean to indicate if this file should be a part of the build or not, or should be considered part of the build based on the given list of include and exclude patterns. And again, the filters are applied in the order include, exclude, such that if there are no includes, we assume everything is included by default. Now we don't need that. We don't need that. This might not even be necessarily, we might say if, just as we sit down there, if there's no includes, or, have I included FN match yet? I did not. Let's just go and pull, I believe it's fn match.fn match. Yeah. So we need to import fn match like so. And we come way down to here. If not include or fn match file name. Oh, see, and here's where we might need a loop. Okay, so I knew there was a loop in here somewhere, because that's going to take the comparison is case sensitive, whereas otherwise it's case insensitive. That's something for us to think of here. If the operating system is case insensitive, both parameters will be normalized. That's interesting. I wonder if this is a better way to do what I was doing instead of using the lambda that I was using before. That is an interesting concept. I could see if a file name matches to determine. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. You pass it a file name, you pass it a pattern. And okay, this would be pattern, right? This is going to be tricky. What is a good way to lay this out? I'm not sure. So let's take a hit from the coffee weasel. Because it's not as simple as that one, we can't say if the file name is in the list of includes. We have to loop over the list of includes in order to determine unless the list is empty. And we have to do includes first and then excludes. So if we looped over things that are includes and we didn't find it, then we have to leave. So we might say for pattern in includes. Okay. By default, we didn't find it. Loop over all of the patterns. If fnmatch.fnmatch file name pattern found equals true and break, I suppose. If found or not includes, then we got to do it again. So maybe we might want something like list match for file name and patterns. Now this is something, list comprehension, that's the word I was looking at before. We'll see how this goes. You might say for pattern in patterns if fn match dot fn match file name pattern return true, return false. Then we can say if not includes or list match file name includes. Then we do this part. If let's just think about this for a second. Cut all that stuff out. That's how it used to work. So this function takes a file name and a list of patterns, and it returns true if that file name matches any of the items in the patterns list. Otherwise, it returns false. We might also say default if empty, let's say. If not patterns, return default if empty. So this function now takes a file name, a list of patterns, and the default to return if the list of patterns is empty. And if the list of patterns is empty, it returns the default. And if the pattern is in the pattern, otherwise it goes through the list of patterns, returns true if it finds it, and false if it doesn't. So that means we can just say if list match file name includes, and the default, if it's empty, is true. If the list is empty, this is definitely being included. I think we might find that we don't actually need this at all as that argument. We could just return true directly, but let's just double check. So if the file name doesn't, if the list of include paths doesn't exist, then definitely always consider it included, right? In which case we can say if list match, if not list match file name excludes, return true, return false. That's one way to go. That will do something. Now, if we look at this a little closer, if we gave it a list of excludes and the list was empty, what's the default should be? The default should be as this is currently written. Should it be true? No, it should be false, shouldn't it? Is this file in the list of excludes? If there's no excludes, then the list is false. So we might say this. And we could further say just return not list match. And we could further say return list match, and I think not that. And that would be one simple way to do it. And we really want that, of course, to be split over lines. So we gotta do a little of this action, I suppose. So it's still happy. Now let's check how that goes. And we're not getting a particular list of files there, are we? So we have to just make up our own. And we don't even need to prune it. We can say something like, well, maybe we'll leave those there in case we need to test that. file name is equal to sample.py, let's say. Print file name and keep file name includes excludes, right? And the answer to that would be, yeah, we should keep that. We haven't been told to include it. We haven't been told to exclude it. If we instead said star.text, now we're specifically saying we only want to include text files, so that returns false, which is good. If we said we want to include Python files, then it is going to work. If we said we wanted to exclude Python files, it shouldn't be included. We told it to include it, and then we told it to exclude it. If we instead just told it to exclude it, it still doesn't work. And if this was a text file, then it does work. So on the face of it, I mean, that could obviously be more robustly tested, but nothing to it but to do it. If keep, and this would of course be name, and this would be file includes and file excludes, then results dot append, and we could again comment out. Oops, I pulled that line out when I didn't mean to. Shoot. Keep file name star.py and another, oops, and another empty list. So again, this would return a whole lot of nothing because we haven't been told to include those. But if this said text, then it would. So we'll leave it like that, but we will comment those out and bring this. And we should still get the same stuff that we got before, which is, on the whole, pretty nice. What we might want to do, just temporarily, everything in this folder almost is a Python file, right? So if I found this and said that the file exclude patterns was by default star.py, like so, then if I ran the command, the Python files would disappear out of there. And if I took it out, they'd come back. If I specifically said star.py are the files to include, then the only files that match are our Python files, and all that other stuff goes away. Which again is, I think, what we want to have had happen. Now, if we wanted to include the folder pattern obj, then all we're seeing is top level items, because the only folder we can go into is named obj, and there isn't one in the top level. But if instead we said enum, then we do get some stuff in there. This does show a hole in our logic because it should include enum, but it's not picking up doc. So there's still, I think, some work that should go there. I'm not entirely sure how Sublime handles that. But the next step from this point, not counting that whole to-do thing to determine if something is allowed or not would be to set this up so that we can pass arguments like this so that they can come, we can pretend they come from a build system, and then we can force all of the parameters nicely. We don't have to include that anymore. So let's first go here and just vet what we got here. And did I put that back up there? I did not. I should put that back up there. That's all of this, right? Yes. We'll come back up to here and go boom, like so. Now I think those should be actually 2 lines apart there and 2 lines apart there if we cared, which we kind of do. So one of the few things in the PEP things that I found not overly egregious, that still seems to do some stuff. And if we came back, okay, did we need FN match? Yes, we do. We can stage that hunk. We replace that version of keep with one that's actually implemented and one to prune a folder. That seems like it's what we want. So we can stage that hunk. Yeah, we're going to clean that up, so we will stage that hunk. We want those comments. And now here's the magic of this. What it used to be, we used to just scan in, and now we scan in prune folders. And keep files or not. So we'll go ahead and stage that hunk, and then we can say include an initial implementation for filtering. This includes an initial version of a command that required me to use the menu of code that can filter away files and folders. While walking, keyboard slightly out of position. Excuse of the night. This includes an initial version of the code that can filter away files and folders while walking through the list of project folders, resulting in just collecting the list of files that should actually appear as a part of the build. Currently, this is naively pruning away entire portions of the tree based on whether or not it should recurse into subfolders or not. This works as long as I use this menu. Only one child level. Otherwise, when we hit level 2 and beyond, we skip folders that we should probably include because their parents match the spec, even if they don't. To be honest, if that's the case, I'm not entirely sure how one might go about fixing that, but nevertheless, the next thing we might note is that if these were coming actually not from a project, for one thing, we might say from a build system, if they didn't all say the same thing. just testing what it looks like if it's empty. This should be a list of paths. It shouldn't be a dictionary object because there can be more than one. Now this one mimics the actual path that the project is in, right? Now we're going to say that that cannot be, okay, that's one thing to change right there. Now we have to give this a bit of thought for what to do here. I was just thinking, okay, let's just say we don't care about that. So we can get rid of those as well. And I'm going to scratch my ear. And, oops. That was completely unrelated to ear scratching. This also needs to be just an empty. We'll leave that, but actually that's a horrible problem. I should probably actually be something like this. I think there are certain keys that are required, so that would allow us to test that as well. What do we want to do if a build system has a path that's a dot? I would almost say reject it because if it's in a project and you use dot, it's well defined that that means it's relative to the project. There is no such rule for a build system. Dot might be the current working directory, but that is in no way a good idea to use because then the folder that it's expanding out to would change based on where you are currently in the project or something like that. That's the sort of indeterminate action one doesn't care about. It would be easy enough to say that it's relative to the package folder because we already know how to do that. But I think it's perhaps best to complain if the path isn't absolute and there isn't something that it can be made relative to. Now, just for test purposes, that's still, with only simple prunes that we know are never going to nest, the obj in the pi cache and the bin. That's just going to do what we want in this particular case. For our testing purposes, we could hard code something in there, but I don't think that's a good idea. So let's go ahead and stage these and say make the test specs lists as appropriate. The test spec lists are supposed to mimic the contents of a Sublime build files folders key, but that key should be a list of dictionaries and not just a dictionary itself. That's just gonna make that part a little easier while we come up here. We need to say if project path is none, because I believe we'll do it this way. If search path is none, we would return an empty list, I suppose. Or we might throw, we might raise invalid argument exception. Am I thinking of C#? I might be thinking of C#. Python exception for invalid argument. Which exception should I raise for bad illegal argument? Raise value error, unless you need a more specific exception. All right. And we might say folder entry does not contain a path. Similarly, if the search path that's in the thing isn't absolute, then if the project path is none, raise value error. Paths in folder entries. Not in a paths in non-project folder entries cannot be relative. Otherwise, do that. Now, I think we'll find that that just sort of does what one might expect. Now, this is the part where we come back to the thing that I was doing earlier, because here we might say folders like so. And then we say, if folders is none, do this. And otherwise, folders is something. Now, if we look at all the things that happen in here, data is only used here to get the folder list, which we were given. Path is the project file name path, which has been split or might be none. And it's used not only here, but in that argument. And those are the only things. So we might say path is equal to none. And then if folders is none, do this, which may or may not end up with a none path. If folders was not none, then it'll do something. If folders is none, then path is none. Folders is the folder that you got, and then it can go and do exactly what we want. And we might go ahead and change that to just be none by default like so. And I think that means if I hit it, it does what we would expect. Now, if I was to pass it spec1 down here as the second argument, and we might even, in order to specify what it is, do that. Now when I do it, paths in non-project folder entries cannot be relative. So it got caught up in the fact that the folder entry doesn't contain a path. We might actually want to start with both 3 and 4 here just to see. So if I said 4 and I do it, I just get, whoops, excuse me. There are no folders, so I get just the current file. Good, that's what I want. If I used spec3, if you recall, spec3 is an empty folder list, but there is, or an empty, it's an array with an empty object in it. Then when I do it, I should get this entry doesn't contain a path. Okay, that's the one key that you actually need in there, right? And now is the part where spec1 and spec2, and again, if I do this, we can see spec2 is literally what's in the project. So if I copy the file's path and put it, I might modify both of these at the same time. Do a little of that. And a little of that. Oh, that's unfortunate. How did that end up with an extra one? Spec 1 is just everything in this thing, and spec 2 is that one. So if I did down here, I'm going to go ahead and zoom that out. If I did spec 2 here, then what I get is what I used to get before: top level files, the important parts of the remote build, so that's all the source code, but not the bin directory, not the obj directory. Everything inside the net test and enum folders except PyCache, which is stuff that is oh, I did spec 2, right? Yeah. So that's the one that's like the project. So that's what we would expect. And if it also threw away the Git folder. So now when I do spec 1, it should be back to the way it was at the start of this operation, right? Like so. Now we can see, oh, maybe we can't. Maybe I need to do something more magic. Oh, that's right, because the sort of running afoul of how the global settings get added. So the global excludes still include Git. So Git's getting thrown away. Let's go ahead and check that. Uh-oh. Oh, I made it angry with that one, my friend. There we go. Oh, I opened the folder. Okay. I wonder what the holdup there was. That sort of thing makes me nervous because the last time my system spent a long time doing stuff in response to file system calls, the hard drive exploded on me. We should probably make sure this is totally checked out. For file exclude patterns is already including PyC files, which is why the stuff from the PyCache folder isn't appearing in there, and folder excludes is already throwing that away. It seems like the contents of the bin folder should still appear in there because they're not. Oh, actually, I have my own file exclude patterns over here, don't I? Why are those the same over here? I guess because I had a different one in there at one point. And if you want to change this list, you have to add it over here, and you can't just override the table in place, so you got to copy the whole thing. O files, lib files, exe files. So it would imagine that oops, the stuff. Oh yeah, this file doesn't have one. Files in the bin directory in the remote build server are automatically being redacted away because there's no interesting ones there. But we could actually check that. If well, I don't have to do that. I can do this. If I look cd'd into remote build server and the bin folder, for example. Well, actually, we could just do this. Tree bin. There's a JSON file in there, but there is a bin folder. So let's just check and see what that does. And again, we'll go and pull that. Folder excludes doesn't include bin in mine. And spec 1 doesn't include it. JSON files shouldn't be excluded, so this might actually, oh wow. That just suddenly got a lot bigger than the whole screen. That's interesting. I don't know if that's, well, it's, incidentally, this is the size of the window if it's on my right-hand monitor. Here it's maximized, and as soon as it moves over, it immediately gets too big. That's interesting. Irritating, but interesting. I'm going to leave it over on this window for the time being. If that is the case, then when we run this command, oh, we actually do see it in there. Good news, I'm just blind and dumb. Clear the console. Okay, so again, if I did this, if we actually went down one and did a tree, don't reset in Terminus, it gets mad. There's all the stuff in bin and obj. There's messages. There's a PyCache folder in nettest, only in nettest, that has a PyC file in it. But as we can see, if I bring this tab over here temporarily, PyC is in the file exclude patterns. And if that gets excluded, this path doesn't show up at all because we only get full paths and file names. Which also raises the question that maybe we need to also stash folders that exist. That is a nice little extra twist on this, but that does mean that our stuff is still doing what we want. So now we need to totally investigate that whole, do we want to exclude sub children just because one part of the tree got thrown away? So let's go ahead and stage that hunk and that hunk. And that hunk as well. And then if we were to look at things that are staged, we could say error check folder entries better in order to ensure the happiness of people that don't want this package to blow up in their face like an overinflated balloon. This adds some error checking to the code that handles path entries. Wait, oh, those are the files that are modified. These are the ones that are staged. Excuse me. This means that in particular, we want to ensure that in cases where there is no project file for us to be able to determine where relative paths are relative to, we instead throw an exception if the path is relative in this case. Additionally, we also ensure that there's actually a path defined, since that is also quite important, right? And we ship that off, and now we can modify this and modify, well, I staged the whole file, right? Enable find project files explicit path list. In order to be fully functional, we saw how easy that actually was to do. The thing that hung me up before the stream was that stuff that we just checked in. It was causing a problem, and I didn't want to spend time doing that because I needed to get the stream ready to go. So in order to be fully functional, we need our command to be able to not only gather the contents of windows with a project in them, or just windows with a folder, but also explicit folder lists defined as a part of the build system. As such, this function now takes an optional list of folder entries which would come from the build system, right? And falls back to asking for the data from the project or the window only if that's not provided. And that gets us a fair amount of changes for tonight. We have been going roughly an hour. So the question then becomes, what part of this were we having problems with before? Because I already forgot what thing was perhaps doing us an injury. I believe it had something to do with file includes or file excludes. That should still just give me the current file. So I might say path is that. Oops, one too many of those. Just cuz. Okay, so when I do it, after I save the file, oh, whoops, need to do that. My bad. There we go. Maybe we'll even indent that one more level. That gives me everything in this entire thing, right? I imagine the problem was something like, what if you exclude obj but include debug? Because if you exclude obj, it's not going to get inside there at all. Let's see what Sublime does in that case, because I totally have the project right here. Now, unfortunately, that means I also have to specify folder include patterns, right? And if it was just an empty list, we would see nothing over there. But let's say I want enum and I want net test and I want remote build server. Well, actually, yeah. And we want, that's all of them. So if I do that, we end up with enum, but not the contents because we didn't specifically include. We don't have the doc folder in there, right? If I included doc, now enum appears and doc appears. So that's actually interesting. That might actually just be doing what we want, to be honest. To verify, we can copy all of these items from here to here. We'll add a comma there so that doesn't explode. Now, for our purposes here, I am going to, now that is that actually the whole shebang? This is everything expanded out. Okay. I'm going to clear the console over here. Whoops. That actually opened a new one because I picked the wrong thing. I'm going to clear the console, which is like so. And that is scrolled all the way down. Now I'm going to come over here. Now remember, what's in here is essentially identical to what's here. The folder is dot, which is the folder that's relative to this, which is that folder. We specifically said exclude obj bin and pycache. We've told it to include enum, nettest, and remote build server. And that's all we did. And it's also picking up settings from the globals the same way that this is theoretically picking up settings from the globals. And if that's the case, if I make this as tall as I can make it, which is unfortunately not tall enough, probably, what do we get to see? They're not in the same order as here, but that is neither here nor there, I would imagine. If we start up here, in enum, we can see init, test, readme, and license. Only those four things. Init, test, readme, license. Exactly as per there. These aren't in lexical order. Although we could sort them to do that. I actually have functionality to do that if I cared, which unfortunately for at the moment, I don't. Next, nettest has init messages and network, and that's the only thing we see here. Remote build server doesn't have, whoops, I accidentally opened that file. Remote build server only has build client, extensions, main, and the CS proj, which is exactly what's there, even though there actually is more content in that folder. And the top level stuff, messages, there's how many here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So those are all here. We got git ignore is right there. File gather is right there. License is right there. Messages.py is the first one in the list. Network.py is that one. Panel.py is that one. README is that one. Remote build is that one. And then the Sublime build file and the Sublime settings file and the widget context Sublime menu file. So that is all of the things that are there. So on the face of it, that actually does what we want. Now, again, if I came back to this, we can see that inside remote build, there's also a messages folder that we don't see here because we didn't tell Sublime to include it, right? So if that was the case, I'll go ahead and close that. What if I changed this to remote build server / messages? Now remote build server is gone entirely. There may be more subtlety to how this works, but in general, we don't even want the slash on there. Even the slash on there breaks it. So that is also interesting because I am willing to bet, again, if I bring this window back over, when I do it with that, we can see that's there. But if I change this so the remote build server has the slash in it, and then I do it again, and I'll even clear the console here. Do it again, it is gone entirely. So I was thinking we needed to trim that, but it actually just behaves exactly the way Sublime behaves, which is pretty good. That's both interesting and scary because that would seem to indicate that the next thing we need to do is try to figure out what we're going to do with this information. we need to transmit to the remote end a list of all of the file names. We need to know, as we can see here, they're all relative to the folder. So we need not only this information, but also a key that says what folder those files are in. So in this case, this might be, say, a dictionary that's returned where the key is Home T. Martin, local source, Devember 2018. And the value is the names of these files. And then that would be enough to tell the other end, okay, there's going to be a folder. On my end, it's called Home T. Martin, local source, Devember. And these are the files that are contained within it. And here's the contents of those files. You as the server have to, somewhere on the file system, create a folder, name it whatever you want. Remember the path of that. Create this list of files inside there. Anything that's referring to the names relatively, as long as they're relative to that folder, will work the way we want. And when errors come back, we know if we see a line that matches an error and it has the path name that is the path that the server put the files in, the server knows it can pull that path information off and replace it with the information for the path that it knows that it is. How exactly we perform all of that is the next exciting installment of Devember, which is going to happen tomorrow on Saturday the 15th. And remember that Saturdays and Sundays being my chore days and longer exercise days and family days and errand days. Those are days where I don't have a lot of time to pre-plan anything per se. So we're gonna have stuff to do, but it may not be as full-fledged as all that. Because even in cases like our weekdays here, where I don't have time to actively do anything, I can at least spend some time while I'm, walking the dog or something, thinking about it a little bit, but I don't tend to do that on the weekends. In any case, we're going to go ahead and call this stream because we are approaching about that time. My watch is actually 100% charged. How exciting is that? So we are going to give you the old salute, even though you can't see it, but you get to see it in the devlog. So that's good. And say, until this Saturday, stay sublime.